So good afternoon. Welcome to number 3 on the series using this book, Being Interrupted. Today we've got Lynn Collins speaking to us, and Liz will introduce her in a moment. But before I do so, I'd like to pray. Again, the prayer adapted from Augustine of Hippo. Lord Jesus, let me know myself and know you, and desire nothing save only you. Let me do everything for the sake of you. Let me humble myself and exalt you. Let me think of nothing except you. Let me be willing to obey for the sake of you. And let me be poor because of you. Look upon me that I may love you. Call me that I may see you and forever enjoy you. Amen.
Amen.
So Liz, over to you.
Thanks. Well, it's a particular delight to welcome Lynn Collins to today's session. Lynn's Rector of Stockport and Brinnington. And I don't know whether you remember, Lynn, but you were in one of my classes when I was a rookie tutor, first teaching ordinands. And I always used to think of you as the student who asked awkward questions. And I think it's your ability to ask difficult questions that's led to you being the current chair of the National Estate Churches Network and part of the Church of England's Estates Evangelism Task Group and on an advisory committee to the Archbishop, I gather. So this course is very much your area of expertise, Lynn, and we really look forward to what you're going to say to us. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. Gosh, what a build-up. Oh, thank you. 2 or 3 years ago, in conversation with Al Barrett, and he told me that he and Ruth Harley were working on the production of a new book. He said it would be something along the lines of it being a big project. It would consider how the interplay of issues of race and class and gender impacted the church. There'd be cross-cutting themes as to how that would affect the status quo, how it could be disrupted from the outside in, and something about the inbreaking of God. And as I listened to him, I thought, you know, Al, I've got really a lot of time for you. I've got a lot of time for your approach and your ministry, but this time, matey, I have a feeling you've bitten off more than you can chew. That sounded massive, complex, unwieldy. Anyway, our sitting here today attests to the fact that I was wrong, and he and Ruth have published, to great and well-deserved acclaim, an inspirational book, as many of you have got. Here it is, Being Interrupted. And indeed, I feel it meets all of those envisioned outcomes that he talked about a couple of years ago and more. So it was my privilege to be asked to write a foreword to that book. And indeed, it's my privilege again today to have been invited by Liz and Jane to bring you some thoughts around chapter 6 in particular, which is entitled Getting on the Wrong Side of Jesus, and focusing, for the purposes of this session, on the latter part of the chapter, WWZD, or I understand we've got somebody from Canada, so that's possibly WWZD. What would Zacchaeus do? I've been asked to assume that you have no prior knowledge of the book or the chapter. So I will explain and or quote from sections that I intend to reference. So please bear with me on it if you have read it and are familiar with it. So let's begin with a little scene setting, should we? So in the previous chapter, in chapter 5, Ruth and Al have suggested that there are 2 economies at work in the church. Economy 1, they term counting in. So in economy 1, what is most valued is what can be most easily counted. So numbers of people attending and money. In this model, investment is made in that which can bring in more things that can be counted. So more people and more money. But this system commodifies. Al and Ruth quote sociologist George Ritzer's analysis of McDonald's, the McDonald's effect on society, what he terms McDonaldization. And they note Scottish theologian John Drain's adaptation of this to describe the McDonaldization of the church, suggesting the church displays the same 4 key characteristics as the fast food giant in the striving for efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control. I don't know, as a bit of an aside, I don't know whether any of you have ever read The Theology of McDonald's. Has anybody ever seen that piece? Really quite an interesting piece about what the church could learn from the McDonald's delivery model, which is quite interesting. I preached it at one of my first sermons in Stockport, and a couple of people walked out. So there you go, Liz. That's where asking difficult questions gets you. So in chapter 6, our chapter of interest, Al and Ruth move on to economy 2, what they term giving out. Here there's a flow, an outpouring from the church into the wider world. And that flow is usually in the form of service or proclamation or both. They say that 2 things keep us operating in giving out mode. That's worship and our understanding of what that does to us. And secondly, where we imagine Jesus to be in the world. Al and Ruth speak of worship filling us out, filling us up to give out. And that's the first area that I'd like to raise on this chapter for further thought today. We can only be filled up to give out in worship if we understand what it is we are being filled with. Experience suggests that many outside the church, and indeed many in our congregations, do not understand our worship. In a previous parish, I had 2 women from the nearby social housing estate begin to attend our church after being guests at a baptism. So they were bright, chatty, warm individuals. They each held roles, one a paid role, one a volunteer role in community service and community care. They had standard educational backgrounds plus work-based qualifications. They were typical, in fact, of many millions of people in this country. And one day, after they'd been coming along to church for a few months, I asked them how they found the service, how they found the language, what they took from worship generally. And one of them immediately said, when you're at the front saying the words of the service, Lynn, it's like you're speaking French. It's like you're speaking French. And I then asked what they got from the Bible readings each week. We used what we felt was an accessible, plain English translation. And their response was that the Bible readings felt like coming in halfway through a film. So our common worship liturgy, the liturgy that I'm told is suited to the reading age of the average 14-year-old in this country, may feel to many, many thousands of ordinary people up and down the land as if we're speaking a language that is completely foreign to them. It's unintelligible. They may be able to physically read the words, but the meaning is lost on them. And that description of the Bible readings being like coming in halfway through a film, I think is absolutely spot on, don't you think? Hardly ever are our readings framed with any form of explanation of context or the characters involved or the broader narrative. So in our worship, with our liturgy that can't be understood and our Bible readings that mean little, it's hard to imagine that many are in any way adequately filled in order to give out to others. Al and Ruth write that in worship, the church receives from God to give out to the world. But just imagine how much more effective we would be as the church in giving out if everyone understood what it is they were taking in, what it is they were receiving from God. The whole conversation with those women, in fact, took me back in time to a period where I worked for a housing association, and we tapped into some research that suggested around half of tenants didn't understand the word arrears. So we were sending out letters and we were having meetings with them talking about their arrears of rent. And somewhere between 40 and 60% of those that we were talking to had no understanding of what the word arrears meant. At the time, we also tapped into some kind of anecdotal research that suggested that the Sun newspaper, and I'm not sure how true this is, but the Sun newspaper was apparently written with a self-limiting database of 500 words. Now that is accessibility, though goodness knows what the 500 words might be in the Sun newspaper. So there's work to be done on how we convey God's word as church at the most fundamental level in our acts of worship. We're speaking Christendom language into a post-Christendom context, and it's failing to connect. And Al and Ruth then go on to explore the second aspect of this giving out of economy too. Where do we imagine Jesus to be in the world? They speak of approaches where we either see ourselves in some sense inhabiting the place of Christ, or we see Jesus located in the neighbour. They quote from Matthew 25, "For I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink," and so on. Giving out to the neighbour equates with giving out to Christ. So in serving every person who is hungry and who is thirsty, in need of clothes and so on, we are serving him. And Al and Ruth point in both models, in seeing ourselves in the place of Christ or in seeing him located in the neighbour, we are the benefactors. We are taking the initiative. We are serving. We are giving. The neighbour is passive on the receiving end. The neighbour is in need. There feels something in that section for me which relates to a conversation I had recently with a member of my own parish here. They asked me whether we still had a problem with the homeless. And I said no, but we were still blessed by them. And what Ruth and Al introduce here is the question of who is giving out to whom. And I think that's a really, really interesting thought for us all in the kind of power dynamics, particularly at parish level, I think. They speak of the issues involved in doing for and of centering ourselves in ways that are paternalistic and that reinforce an unjust status quo. And then they go on to reference a theologian I'd never heard of, actually, a theologian called Jennifer Harvey, a critical white theologian. And she writes as follows: "Doing for others and working on behalf of others in ways that are paternalistic are just the kinds of patterns of behaviour that white people have already been trained in through their invisible schooling in whiteness. And it just so happens that such broken ways of being towards which white people are already prone are likely to be triggered or maybe even amplified by identifying with a social justice Jesus, who is the central power agent in his saga. Simply put, identifying with the divine is about the last thing that a white person whose life is embedded in white supremacist structures should be doing." Whoa, that hits you between the eyes, doesn't it? That's powerful stuff from Jennifer Harvey. And we're invited to consider whether we recognise one or more dimensions of structural privilege in our own identity. I wonder in what ways you might hear that. How might you respond to the list of possible privileges that Al and Ruth give? Privileges such as being a white person whose life is embedded in white supremacist structures, and or being a man whose life is embedded in patriarchal structures, and so on. And I'd return to that issue of language that I mentioned a few moments ago. Is there some sense, I wonder, in which we quite like that we understand our liturgy and worship narratives and others don't? That we enjoy some privilege there? We're in the club. You may be familiar with the work of psychologist, author and feminist Dr. Jess Taylor, who does such powerful work around victim shaming. She speaks powerfully around the laziness, that's how she terms it, the laziness of those who publish inaccessible material. She says, if everyone can't read what you publish, you are not trying hard enough. So with our liturgy, with common worship, perhaps we may see ourselves as traditionalists, but at a deeper level, are we not power holders and gatekeepers? Do we simply not care that we've created a body of worship that doesn't speak clearly enough to enough people? And then we come to Zacchaeus. Al and Ruth use the story of Zacchaeus to highlight their feeling that once we see our multiple privilege, once the penny drops, we cannot unsee it. Just like Zacchaeus, who looked into the face of Christ and was brought up against who he really was, this man who had become rich from defrauding others. He immediately repents and he immediately seeks to make reparation. He was sorry. He wanted to make amends. So from Luke 19, Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. And Al and Ruth return to Jennifer Harvey, who suggests that those of us who are racialized as white in societies entangled in white supremacism, that rather than identifying ourselves with Jesus and asking what would Jesus do, we should identify instead with Zacchaeus. Because she writes, when Jesus encountered Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus didn't hang on defensively to the allegiances that had given him privilege and power up to that point. He chose the path of radical conversion. He disrupts and reverses the flow of money that had enriched him, making reparation to the victims of his exploitation, but also freeing himself from money's stranglehold. Privilege, repentance, and reparation, being aware, being sorry, and making amends. So what might that look like in our own lives? What might that look like in our own churches? Al and Ruth conclude by writing that Jennifer Harvey's challenge is for us to let go of our addictions to being first to speak or to act, for us being central to the story, the heroic providers, the performers, and the possessors. I was at a meeting of National Estate Churches Network many years ago, just as one of the people who'd gone along to the annual conference. And we broke out into little focus groups. And I went along to the focus group that said, is estate leadership on social housing estates too middle class? And naturally, I was drawn to that. So I went along to that group, and there was a chap there who was lovely. He was very well-meaning, but he said, well, of course, the social housing estates need the middle class because they will need the middle class to lead them. And that's very, you know, I thanked him for his honesty, because I think lots of people think that, but they don't actually articulate it. But Jennifer Harvey challenges those of us with any kind of structural power or privilege to disidentify with a Jesus who might reinforce those forms of power, and points us to Zacchaeus as a model of disentangling himself from exploitative structures that give him wealth and security and status. Some of you, do any of you know of the Sycamore Tree Project? Anybody heard of that? So the Sycamore Tree Project is a restorative justice victim awareness course run via the Prison Fellowship, and it takes its name from this story of Zacchaeus. It uses him as an example of a life turned round by acknowledging the impact of his actions on others. And I was in conversation with a prison chaplain, and she told me of a session on the course being run in her prison, where a lad in his 20s with a history of repeat offending was asked to notice how the ripple effect of Zacchaeus's activities negatively affected everyone around him. And he was then asked to draw himself on a large sheet of paper with similar ripples going out. In the first ripple closest to him was the effect of his crimes on his family. Then the next ripple, the effect of his crimes on his friends, then on his victims, on those in the community, and on those in wider society. And as he drew each ripple, his eyes filled with tears. And at the last outer ripple, when that was drawn, he sat staring at the sheet for a long time before looking up and saying, "What I've done is really bad, isn't it?" And that moment of the penny dropping was the start of a new life for him. Awareness, repentance, and reparation. Ruth and I'll close the chapter by asking in a similar way how easy or difficult we might find it to identify with Zacchaeus and why. Perhaps that's another one for today that you might like to think about. As church, we need ever greater awareness of the multiple privilege which creates a culture that marginalizes so many. We need repentance that is sincere and active and results in our making reparation in the ways that we communicate, in the ways that we receive from others, in who is heard and in who holds power. And my final contribution in this little piece is to say, please do read Being Interrupted for yourself if you haven't already. I've tried to do justice to the small section of it that I've been charged with looking at today, but there's so much more to it. There's so much more around stories of disruptive grace and of reimagining church's mission and of the inbreaking of God. I was absolutely privileged to write the foreword, but if you look at the foreword, I'd never been asked to write one before, so I actually had to start by Googling how do you write a foreword, and in fact it all came together. Thank you, Mr. Google. But the authors themselves, I think, will be here for the final slot, Liz, and I'd really urge you not to miss that because they're both so inspirational, and this is a work of real impact. It's a work of genius, I think. So thank you. That's all I was going to say. Did you want anything more? Was that all right?
That was great, thanks. But we'll give people opportunity to ask questions, shall we, Jane? Yeah. Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Lynn. And some important issues there. But I wonder whether anyone's got any questions. Again, I won't necessarily spot you waving a hand, but if you know how to electronically do it, that's really helpful. Nigel, or Helen, as you better know.
Sorry, it's my husband's laptop, that's why I haven't changed the name. Sorry about that. I've been impressed during the pandemic how our local church has been learning rather than teaching, in the sense of getting to know people, and both our estates. We've got a sort of a council estate, but also a more wealthy one up the road. But the needs are evident in both. And it was interesting finding out that sometimes they could help us when we couldn't help them. But other times it was the other way around. You know, we could arrange a Zoom meeting for young mums who were very isolated, for example, and they could get together on Zoom and have a weekly session. But it was really exciting because we felt we were on the receiving end in many ways sometimes, and that was good. It felt good that we were there to serve, but in fact they helped us to serve, if you see what I mean. Without us coming at them, they came at us. We just went to the local community cafe and got to know people and did shopping and stuff for people. It was good in a way we hadn't before, although we'd always been there, but it didn't happen before so much.
That's brilliant. Yeah, that's great.
I have to say, it didn't feel like Zacchaeus. It just felt like helping your neighbour, but then they helped us. So yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really lovely. I think there were so many positives that came out of the church's response to the pandemic, not the pandemic itself, but the church's response, I think, was magnificent. I think we moved forward a decade in about 3 months, didn't we, really, in terms of, you know, our ability to respond to that. It was wonderful. Yeah.
The danger is we go back. Now
Sorry?
The danger is we go back to what we were, you know, or how we did it, instead of keeping on looking at it. I gave my parish, my PCC, the image of, you know, when you decorate your living room and you take all the furniture out and then you decorate it, it's all nice and pristine, but you don't then go putting back kind of the grotty pile of newspaper that you had in the corner of the room or whatever. You choose carefully what you put back. And that's what I said, you know, let's keep that image. Let's not just do what we did before. Let's carefully put back what we think suits our mission in this context. Yes.
So yeah, that's right. We don't want mission slide, do we? And that, no.
Mike.
You talked about the need to communicate in worship, and how much of that do you think is down to the fact that we have a system based on a monologue, not a dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? And hello, Mike. Nice to see you again. Yeah, the most dialogic services I ever had were at St. Stephen's when I was in curacy, and we began a ministry to some women who were sex workers, and they just didn't understand the concept of sitting quietly, which was great. So I would be reading the liturgy and they would be responding and asking questions, or what does that mean, or whatever. So we had to start a separate service because they were just too disruptive to the standing members of the congregation. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. How do we make it more dialogic? Have you got any ideas on that, Mike?
I mean, you can do some things, but the whole structure of how we worship seems to be, you know, people sitting quietly and other people talking. And going back many years, I was in a church when I was young, which after the service we would sit down and discuss the sermon, and I think I learned more from that than I have sometimes from more recent worship. Yeah.
And Jenny makes an interesting point in the chat and says, is worship always about words? Which of course it isn't. I can't see Jenny on the, oh, she's there in the bottom corner. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Jenny?
Sorry, I was blanked out because I was eating my lunch and didn't really be treated to that. I was listening to you when you were talking about the words and everything, and thinking to myself, but in a way, the words just go over my head quite often. It's the fact that I know what they are, and I'm not struggling to think about what do they mean. I'm there, and there's something about the entire atmosphere, and what the actual words mean quite often isn't the main point.
No, but is that because you know what the words mean and can therefore go into a deeper sense of reflection? Would it mean the same if you'd never understood what the words mean? I don't know if that might be slightly different. What do you think?
No, I don't think I do need to understand the words. I mean, obviously I've got a sense of what they're about, but I've been in worship in foreign countries where I don't speak the language, or don't speak enough of the language to really have much sense of what's being said. And it's fine, actually. Because yes, I do go into a deeper place, and it's a place where I'm with God.
I just wonder, though, in terms of our being filled up to give out, whether if that was your experience every week, whether you would be as filled as you could be. I don't know. It's a difficult one, isn't it? But
well,
yes.
Obviously, I don't know. I haven't spent long enough, in that situation to know. But the concept of being as filled as you could be strikes me as an interesting one. What does that mean?
Well, it just means if you really do not understand the language, and it is your language, so it is your tongue.
Yeah.
Is there not a sense that there's something other about that?
I mean, I think that could be very alienating. And so I think the interesting question then would be to ask the women, so why are you still coming? What is it you're getting out of it? What is this about for you? Because if they kept on coming, despite the fact that it must have felt very alienating, what does that say? And it says perhaps that maybe the words aren't the most important thing. I mean, I'm not saying this to get us off the hook of being accessible, comprehend, for people to understand and all of those things. I'm just saying I think we could get way too hung up on something which is not the be all and end all.
Okay. Yeah.
Jane. Yeah.
I thought the book was fabulous. The 2 chapters I've read, which are relevant to the talks we've been having. And I taught economics for 30 years, so I'm very interested in the distribution of wealth and the way wealth and power go hand in hand, and the interaction between wealth and power. But I think there's a danger of demonizing the wealthy if we're not careful, a kind of inverse snobbery, and assuming that because somebody was born into a wealthy family, and none of us chose the family we were born into, that therefore you're automatically a sinner, you're automatically a bad person. And that's not my experience. All my family before me, I was the first one to go to grammar school and higher education. They were all in service. And there was a tremendous amount of loyalty to the local landowner, the Duke of Rutland in one case. And they were just so loyal to all of the people they worked for. And the people they worked for looked after them. They provided pensions and housing and education if they had a very bright child. The ones who got pregnant, they were given accommodation and financial support. And there was a big interaction between them. And it was never as cut and dried as the wealthy person is really evil and the poor people are really, good saints who are just being neglected. And I give talks regularly about our link in Russia, about the poverty there is unbelievable. And one of the most interesting talks I gave was to the Wirral Conservative Ladies Luncheon Club. And all the blue rinses sitting there, we had a 3-course lunch and they all fell asleep afterwards, as much wine as you could drink. They were one of the most responsive groups I've ever talked to. They were so engaged in what I was telling you about the situation that we've seen in Russia. And they all put their hands in their pockets and their handbags afterwards. And I took in the most money to give to our charity that supports our parish than any of the other talks. They were falling over themselves to give and to be helpful and to really engage with those people. Just nobody had ever told them before. And they said, this is the usual response I get, we didn't know. And I think if we're not careful, we can assume that anybody and we get this in the cathedral. When I first started worshiping the cathedral 40 odd years ago, you'd get people with fur coats and fur hats, coming to the cathedral. And there's a kind of assumption that they're kind of wrong, and they're people who don't understand and they can't, and I think we must engage with the inner person, not with the trappings, either the trappings of poverty or the trappings of wealth.
Can I push back a little on that? So a couple of things that you said there. So firstly, we're not saying that poor, good, rich, bad. What we're saying is we all need to be aware of perhaps our multiple privilege. And we hold privilege as white people that we need to be aware of. The wealthy hold privilege as rich people. And the more privilege you hold, perhaps the greater consciousness you need of it. So it's about privilege, not where good or bad lies. I think it's quite interesting. I was asked to speak at a Baptist church in London, and I was asked by their leadership to go down there to challenge their congregation in ways that their leadership felt they couldn't. And the challenge was that they were very good at giving away money, but they were very poor at giving away power. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest your lovely ladies were very keen to put their hands in their pockets and give, because that is an altruistic act to some extent. But if you then questioned their positions of privilege in terms of power or status, or some of those other privileges, I would suspect they would be less keen to give them away. So there is no doubt that social mobility in this country is going backwards, and that inequality is greater than at any time in modern history, really. And so there is a problem with the wealthy. There is a problem with the way that the odds are stacked. We've had people lose £1,000. Nearly 5 million people, I think, have lost £1,000 a year off their income today with the universal credit cut. So it's not poor, good, rich, bad, but it is. There is a power imbalance, and there is an issue of social justice, I think, there.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think especially when you've got government in the hands of wealthy people, which is not truly representative of the country. I owe all of my privilege, every bit of my privilege, to state education, which gave me a grammar school education and gave me a grant to go to college. I don't know whether I would have been able to go off to university nowadays. And so, we've got to, education to me is the key to everything. And I think when government is in the hands of a few people who've been to Eton and Oxford, who genuinely don't understand. Boris Johnson this week has shown his lack of understanding of the way other people live by saying, oh, don't worry about the rising gas prices, don't worry about the petrol. It's all just settling down problems. How he's shown that he doesn't understand. And I think that wealth, if it's concentrated in the top in the government like that, then we've got real problems.
Pam, I think you can say something.
Just slightly different. I don't know what your thoughts would be on tokenism. I think that's quite a trap that the church tends to fall into, in that you say, oh, well, we've got somebody on our committee that's of an ethnic, who's from a certain ethnic background, or from a disabled person with a disability or whatever. We can tick a box. But what happens is that they don't actually have any power. It's almost a tokenism that we do. I'm not explaining myself too well, but I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's quite difficult, really, because I think we're at a point where we have to, in some ways, kind of have something of a tokenistic approach, because I think we have to say we have nobody of colour in this group of people. So when I'm asked to speak now at events, I always ask who else is speaking, because I want to know that there's a spread of people, that there is diversity in the people who are speaking, because I don't want to turn up and it be an all-white panel. Men don't want to turn up, if they've got any sense, and it be an all-male panel. We kind of have to, kind of drive it a little bit. And I think that's one way we can do that. But in the dealings that I've got, and we've got a board of trustees at NECM where we've been looking at issues of diversity. Certainly the people of colour that we're talking to are very, very, very wary of that, are kind of saying, how much real power. I've got no interest in sitting there just as a person of colour. I'm there because I'm an expert on governance, or I'm there because I'm an expert on this, that, and the other. So, so that's where we all need to get to, is that we are naturally diverse because we're harnessing the gifts of the whole people of God, without any filters and without any barriers put in place. I was talking to a really interesting bloke the other day who was CEO of a social enterprise. And he talked about, in big organizations, and the church is one such, the greatest diversity is right at the bottom. So the greatest diversity in the Church of England is right at parish level, isn't it? Right at parish level. If you look across the country, you look at the congregations in London and Birmingham and, you know, across the country, the greatest diversity. So the greatest amount of community information and social capital that we have is right at the bottom. And he said, what you need to do as an effective organization is flip the hierarchy. How do you get that level of diversity, which he said diversity is a superpower? How do you get that up into the decision-making processes so that the people at the top understand community dynamics at the bottom and the richness of the diversity there? So I don't know whether that at all answers anything you were thinking of, Pam, but what do you think? What's your feeling on?
I've worked in social services for 33 years in various elements of it. I don't work, and I did do, and often you'd have community representatives and stuff, and it would be a lot of it back along. I'm talking about would be tokenistic, really. Well, I think it's a matter of power imbalances. So you've actually got to give people a real role. I mean, people are always ticking the box with people with a disability. Oh, we've got a disabled person working in our cafe or something, but they're not running the cafe, or they're not contributing to the management of it or the opinions. You know, they're not. So it's one step more, really, and but it's with every organisation, but maybe the church is one of them. Yeah.
Go to the next question just before we finish. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. R.S. Cullens.
Well, I have to own up and say I've not read the book, so I may be misinterpreting what you've said. But as a white, middle-aged male Mancunian, and so part of a liberally persecuted majority, I would say that obviously I'm middle class as well. But I'm also a charity trustee of a charity serving our council estate in Knutsford, which is the town where I live. And we provide a huge range of services to people living on that estate. All of the trustees are middle class, and the charity would not exist without us, mainly because of severe difficulties in the current climate with fundraising. People on the estate just don't, as a general rule, have the skills or to raise the money, because about 4 years ago, the charity board was completely reconstituted, simply because the charity was just about to go bust because they hadn't been able to raise sufficient funds. So what my sort of point is how does that square with the idea that white middle class people should maybe take a step back from such projects, when in fact probably the majority in fact of Church of England projects that are taking place to improve the conditions of those who are less well off are actually started and organized by the middle class.
Yes, very good point. And what's your first name, sorry?
Richard.
So very good point, Richard. Yes. I think there's a few things on that, really. Firstly, I would not in any way suggest you should step back. I would suggest you should step forward, and step forward by including some of the people that are your beneficiaries in order to upskill them in some of the stuff that you can do. I'm sure you're thinking of that already. But I think we need a generation across the church of gateways, not gatekeepers. Too often in the church, what has happened is we've done unto. So very good hearted people have gone into an area and they've provided some skills or some funding or whatever, but actually the area itself hasn't really materially changed. So I give the example of, I grew up in Old Trafford in Manchester, and we had a white middle class leadership of my local church, and they talked about raising up the poor and all these kind of things. And then 40 years later, I went to a conference where the white middle class leadership of that church was still talking about raising up the poor. And so nothing had changed. We're called to be agents of transformation in our communities. We're not called to maintain poverty. So I think that's what I would say, is that in any project that happens in an area that is a low-income community, how is it transforming that community? Not just how is it providing a mums and toddlers group, or how is it funding a food bank? What is happening within that you are actually factoring in some element of transformation, so that people are empowered, leaders are grown, so that in 40 years' time, you don't have the experience I had, where you go back and actually it's just been like going around a hamster wheel for 40 years. So that's what I would say is, please do keep up the great work that you're doing. That sounds fantastic. But please just look at how you could bring in some of the beneficiaries, even just as observers on your board. It's incredibly empowering for somebody who is educated and, has a strong skill set to say, I think if you came and sat with us for a year, you could do this. That's incredibly empowering. So please don't step back. Please do step up. Please involve people from the areas that you're working in. And I think you could just be an absolutely transformative presence there. Sounds wonderful.
I think we've come to the end of our time, have we, Jane? So, as Lynn said, Al, Barrett and Ruth will be with us next week. So don't miss out on that one, whichever one you're going to miss out on next. But do be there next week and have some questions ready for the authors of the book. And we'll see you at the same time next week.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks, bye.